Angel's Landing, the iconic sandstone monolith in Zion National Park, is known for its breathtaking views and challenging climb. But behind its beauty lies a trail marked by tragedy. As of 2024, more than 16 hikers have lost their lives on this infamous route, a narrow pathway carved into sheer cliffs, with only chains to hold on to. To give you some perspective, Zion National Park sees about 4 million visitors annually, and every day, around 1,200 of them attempt to conquer the Angel's Landing Trail. That adds up to a staggering 438,000 people a year. But the real trouble starts when so many of these folks turn out to be complete beginners with little experience, or worse, first-time climbers with no experience at all. And until recently, there wasn't much oversight to manage this massive influx of hikers. From risky stunts to fatal overcrowding to the controversial role of Zion National Park's authorities, the dangers are real and unforgiving. Today we take a closer look at the most tragic deaths on one of America's most infamous trails, the Angel's Landing. As always, viewer discretion is advised. For the best views in Zion National Park, you've got to go where the angels would go. That's how the iconic Angel's Landing Trail is described by the thousands of hikers who cross the gates of Zion National Park every year to tackle this infamous hike and experience the jaw-dropping views from the top. There are 113 hiking trails in Zion National Park, stretching over 90 miles, and since the park opened, 54 people have died there. Out of those, 27 were hiking-related deaths, and here's where it gets really disturbing. 18 of those deaths happened on one single trail. You guessed it right, Angel's Landing. So what's the deal with this specific part of the trail? Why is it so treacherous? And more importantly, is it really as intense as they say it is? The answer lies in the half-mile stretch from a viewpoint called Scout's Lookout to the summit of Angel's Landing and back. This harrowing climb takes you along a narrow ridge with loose rocks and massive 1,400-foot drops on either side. One wrong step, and you're looking at a 1,000-foot plunge to the canyon floor, a fall no one walks away from. The last section in particular is an awkwardly steep cliff face, where a series of chain-linked handrails are drilled into the rock to help climbers pull themselves up. But even with that, it doesn't make much of a difference. Especially during the winter when the park is plagued with flash flood warnings or heavy winds and rain have just rolled through, the sandstone rock faces turn extremely slick and slippery. It was Wednesday, November 20th, 2019, when 19-year-old Savannah set out on the Angel's Landing Trail with two of her friends. A weather warning had been issued for the park's trails due to the recent heavy rains. Savannah worked for the travel company Xanterra and had been stationed at the Zion Lodge as a concession worker. Zion Lodge, a serene base for relaxation and preparation, offers employees free park access and priority trail permits, making it the perfect starting point for the Angel's Landing hike, just a short shuttle ride or walk from the grotto trailhead. That day, Savannah's group decided to tackle Angel's Landing, which had just reopened the day before, after being shut down for days due to a rockfall. But as they hit the trail, park officials were already issuing warnings, urging hikers to be cautious. A winter storm was brewing, and heavy rain was already drenching the trails. Did Savannah and her friends know about these warnings since she was a staff member? Or maybe they did, but probably thought they had everything under control. Tragically, we'll never know. They started the hike together, moving from the grotto onto the gradual uphill climb along the West Rim Trail, which loosely follows the Virgin River for a while. The terrain starts rocky and sandy, but as the elevation kicks in and the river disappears from sight, the trail becomes paved, setting the stage for a much steeper climb. Of course, this gets a lot trickier if the conditions are wet. That's exactly what Savannah ended up dealing with. At some point, she walked behind the group. At first, her friends didn't think much of it, assuming she'd catch up. If you're a hiker, you know that this happens. Everyone has a different hiking pace. But when time passed and she still didn't catch up, it became obvious something was off. The two girls quickly turned back and reported the situation to the park rangers, fearing that Savannah might have slipped off the trail because of the wet, slippery rocks. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately, hoping to find her alive. But after combing the trail carefully, the authorities sadly confirmed that she had fallen off. The next morning, rescue climbers found the body of a female at the foot of the Angel's Landing trail, and she was later identified as Savannah. Since her friends lost sight of her, no one really knows exactly what happened in her final moments, but it seems likely that she lost her footing on the wet pavement and fell a fatal distance off the trail. Zion's sandstone rocks are notorious for being slippery, and in wet conditions like these, they become downright deadly. The rock's porous grains absorb water quickly, dramatically cutting down friction. Over time, this leads to the growth of moss, algae, and other organic materials that make the surface more treacherous, even on dry days. What's worse is that sometimes people, overconfident and eager to push the limits, ignore the safety guidelines, and all too often it ends in disaster. Savannah and her friends did that too, but they weren't the first ones, nor would they be the last, to make this deadly mistake. 63-year-old George Sender was on a trip to Zion National Park in August 2000 as part of a large group of German tourists who had come to experience the wonders of Utah's rugged landscapes. Their trip had been organized by a well-known German company, Rotel Tours, that specializes in overland journeys in custom-built buses that double as rolling hotels, where guests can sleep as they travel. It was peak summer and Zion was buzzing with energy. Trails were alive with hikers and sightseers from all corners of the world, while the Virgin River flowed through the canyon, framed by lush, vibrant greenery. The park in all its natural beauty was putting on quite the show. For George and his group, the whole atmosphere felt like something out of a dream. Every corner of the park offered a new sight to marvel at, and they were soaking up all the magic. As a part of his adventure, George had made up his mind to take on Angel's Landing, just to add a bit of thrill to the trip. Like most hiking fans, this trail was a must-do on his bucket list, and after traveling all the way from Germany, there was no way he was going to miss out on the chance to see it firsthand. So after careful planning and plenty of anticipation, George laced up his hiking boots early on the morning of August 2nd, 2000, ready to take on the challenge and make the most of the cooler hours. The first few stretches went smoothly, and George eventually reached the solid pavement, leaving the winding dirt roads behind. From here on out, the biggest challenge ahead is navigating an intimidating series of 21 tight, steep, hairpin switchbacks called the Walters Wiggles. Once you pass that, you'll land at a popular resting spot with panoramic views of the canyon called the Scout's Lookout. It's a great place to catch your breath, but it's also where the trail gets particularly dangerous. The warning signs ahead are hard to miss, and for anyone afraid of heights or dealing with medical conditions, this is the spot where they're strongly advised to stop, even under the best conditions. But for George, things were different. He hadn't faced any major obstacles so far, and by the time he reached the stretch just below the summit, the trail was starting to feel almost too predictable. Just walking the same path as everyone else didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the growing crowd of hikers clogging up the trail, or maybe his own curiosity. But something inside him wanted more. He couldn't shake the idea of seeing those cliffs from a totally different angle, somewhere untouched by the usual footprints. He chewed on it for a while, but the desire to break free finally won. And as a hiker, I get it. There's something about the mountains that just pulls you in. George stepped off the marked path and started making his own way. This was a clear violation of the park's safety guidelines, but George was too excited to care. For a while he roamed freely, finding new angles to admire the towering cliffs and endless views. It was exhilarating, even if it was risky. After some time, feeling pretty satisfied with the unsettling adventure, he figured it was time to return to the main trail and wrap up the hike safely. As he started making his way back, he reached a small cliff face that he needed to descend to get to the main path. But just as he was working his way down, he lost his footing. The rocks were slick, and in the blink of an eye, he slipped. If you've ever had any kind of a fall, you know that instant gut-wrenching feeling where you have absolutely no control. It wasn't a huge drop, only about 10 to 15 feet. But it was enough. When he hit the ground, his head slammed into the rocks below. The impact was instantly fatal. Too fatal that nearby hikers heard the noise and quickly called for help. Park rangers, medical technicians, and a local doctor rushed to the scene, but they could do nothing. By the time they arrived, George had already passed away. For hours after his death, the steep, rocky terrain made it impossible to get him off the trail, so eventually, they had to call in a helicopter to airlift his body out. Safety rules can definitely feel like a pain to an adventurous hiker, but often they do save lives. But it's not always an uncalculated stunt that can backfire. Sometimes, even when you think you've got everything covered, a small mistake is all it takes for things to go south. In 1997, 36-year-old seasoned hiker John Christensen figured there was no better way to welcome the new year than doing what he loved most. So, on the night of December 31st, 1996, he set out to tackle the 1,200-foot right side of Angel's Landing, and he was doing it solo. This wasn't his first rodeo. John was a master at technical climbing, and the day before, he just secured 2 of the toughest sections of the climb. So although he was scaling one of the most dangerous parts of the cliff, there was no doubt in his mind. He had the skills, the confidence, and all the right equipment. Figuring the conditions could turn any time, he had carried full rain and cold weather gear, as well as securing ropes and a headlamp. The climb up was pretty standard, and just a couple of hours later, he was at the top of the cliff, having spent the turn of the year up there. After hanging out for a while, he decided to head back down as the cold weather was getting intense. But here's where things got a little weird. He made a strange decision. Instead of just walking off the mountain, he decided to rappel down the climbing lines. The exact reason behind this move is still a bit of a mystery, but considering his solid experience with technical climbing, it seems like he wasn't just looking for a random thrill. Maybe he figured it was safer in the dark than walking down the cliff, or maybe it was faster since the cliff's side was almost vertical. Rappelling would definitely be quicker. Whatever his reasoning, John had complete confidence in his own abilities. He used 2 200-foot ropes. One was 0.4 inches thick, the other a little thinner at 0.3 inches, and tied them together, feeding the ends through anchors that were securely fixed to the rock. After making sure everything was nice and safe, he started his descent with the rappelling device. The first few hundred meters were smooth sailing, but out of nowhere, he lost his grip and couldn't get it back. John fell a solid 600 to 800 feet straight down to the canyon floor. We can only guess the kind of impact he would have taken. Probably way more than just a few broken bones. The last person to see John was a fellow climber at 9 p.m. the night before. After that, no one saw him either making his way to the top or coming back down. So, what went wrong with his climbing line is still a mystery. Experts think it could have been because he was using 2 ropes with different diameters. A thicker rope causes more friction at the anchor point than a thinner one, meaning the thinner rope could have fed through the belay device a lot faster. While this might have been a problem for a rookie, seasoned climbers like John probably knew how to handle it without much issue. Another theory is that loose rocks might have fallen and hit him, making him lose his grip, or maybe he just lost his footing and grip in the darkness. When John didn't return home the next morning, his friends and family called search and rescue. They found his body the next day at the base of Angel's Landing on January 2nd. John's death marked the only fatal technical climbing accident in the park's 30-year history, since climbers were first allowed to scale the sandstone cliffs. And it's hard not to wonder if things might have turned out differently had he been climbing in daylight. But with no system in place to monitor climbers' schedules, whether day or night, there was no stopping him. This lack of oversight has long been one of the most debated issues surrounding deaths at Angel's Landing. The long absence of proper climbing permits was a big part of the problem. While the trails see hundreds of visitors during the day, those trying to avoid the crowds often head out early in the morning or late at night. In other words, when poor lighting and bad conditions make the path even riskier. On top of that, they're completely out of sight, leaving no one to step in if something goes wrong. That's exactly what happened with John. But sadly, It wasn't the first time. It was the evening of April 2nd, 1989, when a group of hikers was making their way across the final stretch of the chained section leading up to the summit of Angel's Landing. It had been a long, exhausting day, and after spending about 5 or 6 hours on the trail, they were finally about to soak in those jaw-dropping panoramic views of Zion National Park they'd heard so much about. Fueled by excitement and anticipation, they climbed the last few steps one by one, reaching the top of the cliff. But there, instead of stunning scenery or sweeping landscapes, they were met with something that would haunt them forever. Just a few feet from the edge of a scary drop, an abandoned backpack covered in blood lay next to a massive pool of red. The sight was chilling, but the questions swirling in their heads were even worse. What on earth had happened here? What was in that backpack? And more importantly, whose blood was that? Panic quickly took over as they scrambled to call Zion's emergency services. The rescue teams got the alert, and while they were still trying to make sense of the sketchy details, another call came in about the same scene. And that's when the disturbing truth started to come to light. On the other end of the line was a helicopter pilot who had just flown over the top of Angel's Landing. About 150 feet below the summit, on the opposite side of the trail, he saw a body that had fallen over a rocky ledge. The backpack and blood seemed to belong to the same person. The search and rescue teams got to the scene as quickly as they could, but due to the tough terrain and dangerous drop below, it took them 19 hours to finally retrieve the body. Once they did, they launched a thorough search to identify the victim, revealing him to be 28-year-old Jeffery Robert Dwyer from Sandpoint, Idaho. Jeffery had been traveling with 2 others on a 7-week trip through the western United States and Mexico. At first, his death looked like a simple accident, a random fall from the top of Angel's Landing. But there was one strange detail. Jeffery's body was found 150 feet below a pool of his own blood, hinting he might have been bleeding badly before taking that fatal plunge. Investigators also found a packet of substances in his pocket, which made things even more suspicious. Was it just an accident, or was there something more to this? The FBI got involved, and there was speculation that it could have been a self-inflicted fall or even a murder. The substances suggested Jeffery might have been using them to deal with some emotional or mental struggles, which could have led to a self-inflicted death. On the other hand, the severe bleeding before the fall could imply that someone might have attacked or drugged him, maybe even pushed him over the edge, or just left him to die. When the autopsy results came in, they couldn't pin down anything more than a massive head injury as the cause of death. The investigation dragged on, but there was nothing solid to support either theory. Eventually, they just ruled it an accident. The most likely scenario is that Jeffery had some sort of an unknown accident before reaching the top, causing him to bleed heavily. While dealing with that, he might have passed out or just slipped and fell over the edge. The truth, however, is still a mystery. No one knows when he actually entered the trail. The last time anyone saw him alive was a day before his body was found, so maybe he started his hike at night and ran into a bunch of mishaps because of poor visibility, kind of like what happened to John Christensen. Or maybe there could be something much more disturbing at play. Jeffery's death remains one of the most controversial fatalities in Zion National Park. The details about the 2 people traveling with him were never revealed, and this is where the park authorities get a lot of heat. They've been accused of downplaying incidents and withholding important details for a long time. And again, with no permits or oversight over the climbers, no one knows the exact sequence of events. On April 1, 2022, Zion National Park officially introduced a permit system for anyone hiking at Angel's Landing, all to help streamline things on the trail. The new rules capped the number of hikers at 800 per day, down from the previous average of 1,200, aiming to reduce the dangerous two-way traffic along those narrow paths, where hikers often had to squeeze past each other near the cliff's edge, and one wrong step could spell disaster. That's what turned out to be the fate of a 53-year-old anesthesiologist from St. Louis on June 8, 2007. Dr. Barry Goldstein had always been an adventurous soul, even back in his early adulthood. Despite the grueling demands of his career, Barry always found time to push his limits. When he wasn't in the operating room, he was either sweating it out at the gym or traveling from town to town, state to state, chasing mountains and conquering hiking trails. In June of 2007, Barry packed his bags for Utah to attend a family wedding. But the day before the celebrations, the group came up with an idea, one that would change everything. They decided to kick off the big event with a hike up Zion National Park's iconic Angel's Landing. For Barry, this wasn't just an invitation. It was a challenge he couldn't resist. He was all in the second the plan was on the table. Early Friday morning on June 8th, the group stood at the trailhead with smiles on their faces as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the rugged cliffs. The climb started off like something out of a storybook. The air was crisp and the energy was contagious. Barry and the others laughed, joked, and swapped stories as they climbed higher and higher, leaving the trail behind. Time disappeared in their chatter, and before they knew it, they were standing at the top. Perched on the edge of a terrifying drop, surrounded by breathtaking views that stretched for miles. It felt perfect. Too perfect. But that's the thing about perfection, it doesn't last. Barry and the crew realized the trail was getting flooded with visitors more and more. The group, however, too enthused to care, continued hanging out for a while on the top and then decided to start their way back. Their banter and energy remained the same, and soon after they reached the rock ledges with spine-chilling descents on either side. While the trail required careful footing, according to witnesses, Barry and his group were more focused on playing around and strolling past visitors without much thought. Soon, they reached a section where the path was mostly loose rocks, and Barry, always being the one to push his luck, still kept walking closer to the edge with his eyes locked on the views instead of his footing. He didn't notice how close he'd gotten until the rocks that looked solid beneath his feet weren't anymore. The ground shifted, and a quiet crack split the air. Before anyone could react, the pavement beneath him gave way, taking Barry with it. In front of a crowd of onlookers, including his friends and family, Barry vanished into the drop, falling hundreds of meters straight down to the canyon floor. His family could only hope he'd lost consciousness before hitting the ground, so he wouldn't have to feel that terrifying, fatal impact. Following the incident, park officials closed the trail for a while and found his body later that evening. But by then, Barry Goldstein, his fateful misadventure, and their pre-wedding celebration had all been claimed by the vast, brutal expanse of Zion National Park. Barry's tragic fall really got me thinking, how far are people willing to push their luck without even considering the consequences? Is it really that easy to get caught up in the moment, thinking the thrill is worth the risk? A 14-year-old kid from California, all hyped up in the middle of a deadly wager, learned the hard way that some bets are never worth taking. On June 25, 2004, a Boy Scout troop from Provo, Utah, with over 40 scouts and their leaders, made their way to Zion National Park, all pumped and ready to take on the Angel's Landing Trail. The excitement was in the air, one of those moments where you just know you're about to do something epic. Among the group was 14-year-old Christopher Jones from Long Beach, California. He'd been invited to join the trip with the Provo troop since he spent his summers there visiting his family. Christopher was all in, ready to dive into the wilderness and have an adventure worth remembering. Even though he wasn't an official scout, he quickly blended in with the group, being the type of kid who could make friends with anyone in no time. His outgoing vibe clicked with the others, and before long, he was laughing and chatting with the boys like they'd been homies forever. As they got to the starting point, the scouts went through the usual quick briefing and instructions, then split into smaller groups, each hitting the trail at their own pace, with leaders tagging along to keep things in check. At first, the hike was pretty smooth with everyone sticking close together and taking their time. But as the trail got steeper, the younger, more energetic teens started to pick up speed. The adult leaders tried to keep up, but the gap between them and the boys just kept getting bigger. When they finally reached the top of Angel's Landing, the group looked around, and there wasn't another soul in sight. The adults were nowhere to be seen, and they were completely on their own. For a while, they stayed at the summit, enjoying the view, caught in the silence of the moment, and then decided to head back down. However, just below the peak, they stopped on the ledges and realized there was still no sign of the leaders, so they started waiting. And as teenagers do when left to their own devices, they started messing around, jumping from rock to rock, showing off, and tossing jokes back and forth about who was braver, tougher, or just better at not chickening out. Their unsettling fun escalated, and someone threw out a bet at Christopher. $5 to him if he could crawl out onto a narrow, steep ledge and carve his initials into the face of the cliff. It may sound insane to you, but to a 14-year-old teenage boy like Christopher, it probably was just a fun dare. It was a moment to prove himself to his new group. He wasn't about to back down, not with his new friends watching. Boy Scouts are taught to steer clear of risky behavior, but none of the kids stepped in to stop Christopher from taking the dare. But the slick, narrow ledge wasn't meant for anyone to be on. As he started crawling out onto the ledge, one scout watching nearby just shrugged and said, "Don't die." Just moments later, Christopher's foot slipped on it and he fell, tumbling straight down an 800-foot drop. The cheering and laughter turned into horrifying screams as his friends watched in terror, paralyzed, unable to process what they had just seen. The adults were still far behind and panic began to take over. Desperate to do something, 4 of the scouts made another dangerous choice. They linked their arms together and leaned over the edge, trying to spot Christopher below. They couldn't see him, but if they'd taken even one step further, it could have been a second tragedy. Thankfully, before they could do anything else, scout leaders finally arrived and noticed the terror on the kids' faces. Once the kids told them what happened, one of them immediately contacted the park rangers. The rescue team worked through the night, rappelling down the jagged rock face, but it wasn't until morning that they recovered Christopher's body. In just a few seconds, Angel's Landing had claimed another victim, another life needlessly lost to the dangers of the mountain. Losing a child so young is a nightmare no parent should experience. Whose fault do you think was that? Christopher's parents had a pretty straightforward answer. After the tragedy, they sued the scout troop and its leaders for leaving the boys unsupervised. Their attorney argued that as a former scoutmaster herself, she would never have taken 40 kids to a place as dangerous as Angel's Landing, especially without proper supervision. At the end of the day, kids will be kids, and they weren't to blame here. It was the scout leaders who failed to keep them safe, and that failure cost Christopher his life. The tragic circumstances of Christopher's death really bring out another important factor of the hike at Angel's Landing. While it might not be the highest point in Zion National Park, it definitely offers some of the most incredible views. That being said, a lot of experts argue other trails in Zion are just as stunning, but none seem to have the same pull or reputation. The reason Angel's Landing ends up on just about every hiker's bucket list isn't just for the views. It's the hype that comes with it. In hiking clubs and online groups, as soon as you bring up Zion, the first question you'll get is, "Did you hike Angel's Landing?" As the saying goes, the greatest danger on a trail isn't the terrain, but the pressure to climb it for the wrong reasons. Christopher's story, like the others we've told, makes me wonder about hikes like Angel's Landing. Is it Zion's job to pull down the chains entirely so people stop dying? Should they make it safer for hikers? Or is it up to everyone individually to know the risks? Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.